The briefing room at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado fell silent when she walked in. Lieutenant Vera Kask moved with the measured precision of someone who had learned to take up exactly the space she was entitled to and not 1 inch more. Her boots made no sound on the polished floor. The 6 Marines seated around the tactical display didn't rise. They didn't need to. This was an inter-service training evolution, not a formal inspection. But the way their eyes tracked her, the slight curl at the corner of one mouth, the crossed arms and spread knees designed to claim territory, told her everything she needed to know about how the next 72 hours would unfold. She'd seen it before. She'd see it again. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying the flat neutrality of someone from the upper Midwest, "I'm Lieutenant Kask. I'll be your opposing force commander for this exercise." She set her tablet on the table without looking at any of them directly. The silence stretched. Somewhere in the building, a door closed. Footsteps echoed down a corridor. One of the Marines, a staff sergeant with a high and tight so severe it looked painted on, leaned back in his chair until it balanced on 2 legs. "Ma'am," he said, and the pause before the rank told her it wasn't respect. "With all due respect, we were told we'd be facing a SEAL team element." "Not," he gestured vaguely. Another Marine, younger, with corporal chevrons so new they still had crisp edges, snorted. "Try not to cry, princess," he muttered, just loud enough. The words hung in the air like smoke. Vera didn't flinch. She'd heard worse in Hell Week. She'd heard worse in the 2 years since she'd earned her trident. She'd heard worse from men who were now dead, killed by enemies who didn't care about their opinions on women in combat. She simply pulled up the exercise parameters on the main display. "The scenario is a high-value target extraction from a hostile urban environment," she continued, as if nothing had been said. "You'll be operating as a standard Marine rifle squad with attached combat engineer. I'll be commanding a 4-person SEAL element. Rules of engagement are in your packets. We go live at 0400 tomorrow." The staff sergeant let his chair drop forward. 4 against 6, in close quarters. "Ma'am, that hardly seems fair." His smile didn't reach his eyes. Vera met his gaze for exactly 2 seconds, long enough to let him know she'd heard him, not long enough to make it a challenge. "You're right," she said quietly, "it's not." The first indication that something had gone wrong came at 0412, 8 minutes before the Marines were supposed to breach the training facility. The staff sergeant, whose name was Corrigan, held up a closed fist. His team froze in the pre-dawn darkness outside the mock-up building. The structure was a faithful recreation of a 3-story residential block in a Middle Eastern city, complete with balconies, internal courtyards, and enough rooms to make clearing it a nightmare. Standard doctrine said you moved fast and loud, overwhelming violence of action. They had flashbangs, simulated breaching charges, and the weight of 6 trained shooters moving as one unit. Corrigan listened through his headset. Nothing. No radio chatter. No movement. The building sat dark and silent against the lightning sky. He didn't like it. His point man, a lance corporal named Dietrich, was already at the primary entry point, a first-floor window they'd identified during planning. The window was half open. Corrigan didn't like that either. Too easy. But the mission clock was running, and they had evaluators watching from the tower with thermal optics and scoring tablets. He made the call. "Execute primary breach." Dietrich went through the window in a smooth roll, rifle up, scanning. Empty room. Furniture covered in dust. He signaled clear, and the next Marine flowed in behind him. Then the next. Corrigan came forth, his weapon tracking corners and doorways with the automatic precision of 15 years in the Corps. They stacked on the interior doorway. Flashbang out. 3 count. The world turned white and loud, and they poured through into a narrow hallway. Empty. No targets. No opposing force. Nothing but shadows and the lingering smell of dust. "Where the hell are they?" the corporal from the briefing whispered. His name was Park, and this was his first major training evolution since getting to the fleet. Corrigan didn't answer. He was listening. The building was old construction, and sound carried in strange ways. Somewhere above them something creaked. Could be thermal expansion. Could be the structure settling. Could be nothing. He hand-signaled for a tactical halt and checked his tablet. The high-value target was supposed to be on the third floor, northeast corner room. Standard play would have the opposing force set up on the second floor, force them into a fatal funnel. He decided to go counterintuitive. "We're taking the courtyard route," he subvocalized into his mic. They moved through the ground floor, clearing rooms methodically. Every room was empty. No tripwires, no simulated IEDs, no opposing force. They reached the courtyard access, a heavy door that opened onto an open-air space surrounded by walls on three sides. Corrigan hesitated. This was the most dangerous point in the building, complete exposure, but the clock was ticking and they'd already burned 12 minutes. He nodded to Dietrich. The lance corporal moved to the door, tested the handle. Unlocked. He pushed it open and stepped through, weapon up, scanning. The courtyard was maybe 30 feet across, with a dry fountain in the center and crumbling plaster walls rising 3 stories. The sky above was turning from black to deep blue. Dietrich took 3 steps forward. Then the world changed. The sound came from above and behind simultaneously, a sharp crack that made every Marine spin. A simulated flashbang, but not where they'd expected. Not in the courtyard, behind them. In the hallway they just cleared. Contact rear. Someone shouted, but it was already too late. Corrigan saw the muzzle flash from the second-story window, a strobe of light in the growing dawn. His vest registered 3 hits before he could turn. His weapon went dead, the training simulator cutting power. "Corrigan, KIA," his headset announced in the flat voice of the range safety officer. Dietrich tried to return fire, but he was in the open courtyard with no cover and shooters on 3 sides. He went down under a concentrated burst from 2 positions simultaneously, one from the second floor east wall and one from what looked like a maintenance shed roof. Dietrich, KIA. Park and the Marine next to him, a sergeant named Williams, tried to fall back into the doorway, but someone had moved behind them during the courtyard distraction. The shots came from somewhere in the ground floor, impossibly close. Park, KIA, Williams, KIA. The remaining 2 Marines, a combat engineer named Tors and a rifleman named Sue, managed to get into partial cover behind the fountain. Tors was screaming into his radio for a situation report, but all he got back was static and the range safety officer's calm voice announcing casualties. Sue spotted movement on the 3rd floor, a shadow that might have been a person. He fired a controlled burst, but the shadow was already gone. Then something small and dark arced down from the 2nd floor. Training grenade. Tors tried to move, but there was nowhere to go. The simulator registered the blast radius. Tors, KIA, Sue, KIA. The entire evolution had taken 4 minutes and 37 seconds from first breach to complete squad elimination. The debrief was scheduled for 1400 hours, but word had already spread through the base by noon. The Marines had been wiped out without landing a single simulated kill. In the special operations community, news traveled faster than official channels. By the time the 6 Marines filed into the same briefing room where they'd met Lieutenant Kask 36 hours earlier, there were observers in the back row. A Navy captain, 2 SEAL Team senior chiefs, an Army Special Forces warrant officer who was running a separate training evolution and wanted to see what the noise was about. The Marines sat in the same chairs. Their body language was different now. Shoulders hunched, eyes down. The cocky sprawl had been replaced with the tight posture of men who'd been professionally embarrassed and knew they deserved it. Lieutenant Kask walked in at exactly 1400. She was followed by 4 other SEALs, 2 men and 2 women. They moved with the easy confidence of people who had nothing to prove, because they'd already proven everything that mattered. Kask set up the tactical replay on the main display without preamble. "We'll walk through the evolution step by step," she said. Her voice held no triumph, no mockery. This was a teaching moment, not a victory lap. The replay showed the mock-up building from multiple angles, thermal and visible light. At 0345, my team inserted through the roof access here. The screen highlighted a hatch that the Marines had marked as secured during their planning phase. Lance Corporal Dietrich checked that hatch at 2200 during your reconnaissance. He tested it, found it locked, and marked it cleared. What he didn't do was mark it with tamper-evident indicators. She paused. We picked the lock at 0346 and made entry. By the time you initiated your breach at 0412, we'd been in position for 26 minutes. The replay showed Kask's team moving through the building like ghosts, setting up overlapping fields of fire, placing simulated explosive devices in likely fallback positions, and wiring the ground floor hallway with tripwires that would trigger simulated flashbangs. You executed your primary breach exactly as briefed, Kask continued, which meant we knew where you were going before you did. Staff Sergeant Corrigan watched the screen with the expression of a man watching his own autopsy. The replay was brutal in its clarity. His team had moved exactly as doctrine dictated, which meant they'd moved exactly as Kask had predicted. Every room they'd cleared had been deliberately left empty. Every sound they'd heard had been calculated to push them toward the courtyard, the kill zone, the place where the SEALs held every advantage. The courtyard was a natural fatal funnel, Kask said, highlighting the space on the display. 3 stories of elevation, multiple firing positions, and only 2 exits. Once you committed to crossing that threshold, the outcome was determined. She advanced the replay to show Dietrich stepping into the courtyard. At this point, we had 3 shooters in elevated positions and 1 on the ground floor behind you. The simulated flashbang in your rear was designed to trigger your natural response, which was to focus on the perceived threat behind you while exposing yourself to fire from elevated positions you hadn't fully cleared. Corrigan's jaw was tight. Beside him, Park looked like he wanted to sink through the floor. The entire engagement lasted 4 minutes and 37 seconds, Kask said. She turned off the display and looked at them directly. You lost because you assumed the opposing force would fight the way you would fight. You assumed doctrine would prevail because doctrine usually does. And you assumed that a smaller, lighter force couldn't possibly control a structure this size. She paused. You were wrong on all 3 counts. One of the SEALs who'd come in with Kask, a senior chief with a weathered face and gray in his beard, spoke up. The lieutenant set up a perfect ambush because she understood your capabilities and your limitations better than you understood hers. That's not about physical strength. That's not about how many shooters you have. That's about intelligence, preparation of the battlefield, and tactical patience. He looked at each Marine in turn. You rushed. She waited. You followed the book. She wrote a new chapter. The room was silent. Vera Kask could have left it there. She could have made her point and dismissed them with their tails between their legs. Instead, she said something that would echo through the rest of their careers. You're good Marines. You did everything right according to your training, but your training prepared you to fight a symmetrical battle against a predictable enemy. The enemies you'll face downrange won't be symmetrical and they won't be predictable. They'll be smaller, faster, and more willing to die than you are. They'll use terrain and timing and your own assumptions against you. What we did in that building wasn't magic. It was preparation meeting opportunity. And the only reason it worked is because we knew you were good enough to do exactly what you were trained to do. She gestured to the door. You're dismissed. Take the weekend. Think about what you learned. We'll run it again Monday, but this time you'll be defending and we'll be assaulting. Let's see if you can return the favor. Marines filed out in silence. Only Staff Sergeant Corrigan remained, standing by the door as if trying to decide whether to leave or stay. Finally, he turned back. Ma'am, he said, and this time the word carried weight, what you said in the first briefing, about 4 against 6 not being fair, you meant it wasn't fair to us. Kask nodded once. I meant exactly what you thought I meant, Staff Sergeant. Corrigan held her gaze for a moment, then nodded slowly. Understood, ma'am. We'll do better Monday. After he left, the senior chief who'd spoken during the debrief turned to Kask. You could have rubbed their faces in it, he said. Could have made them feel like the idiots they were being in that first meeting. Vera shook her head. That's not why we're here, senior chief. We're not here to prove women belong in special operations. We're here to make sure the people who go downrange come home alive. If that means embarrassing a few Marines in a training evolution so they learn to think differently, that's a price I'll pay every time. The senior chief smiled. That's why you wear the trident, Lieutenant. Outside the briefing room, word continued to spread. By evening chow, the story had evolved. Some versions had Kask's team outnumbered 8-4. Some had the engagement lasting less than 3 minutes. Some had her personally taking down all 6 Marines with a pistol while the rest of her team watched. None of the versions mentioned the comment in the first briefing. None mentioned, "Try not to cry, princess." That particular detail seemed to have vanished from the collective memory, though Corporal Park would remember it for the rest of his life, and would think about it years later in Helmand Province, when a female Air Force combat controller saved his squad from a Taliban ambush by calling in danger-close air support with a calmness that made his hands shake. The weekend passed. On Monday morning at 05:30, the same 6 Marines assembled outside a different training facility, this one a 3-story office complex with stairwells and conference rooms. This time they would defend. This time they had 2 days to prepare. This time they knew who they were facing. Staff Sergeant Corrigan had spent the entire weekend studying asymmetric warfare tactics. He'd pulled manuals on Chechen urban warfare, Viet Cong tunnel defense, and IRA urban operations. He'd interviewed every SEAL he could find in the Chow Hall about how they thought, how they planned, how they approached a defended position. He'd learned that Lieutenant Kask had deployed 3 times to Afghanistan, that she'd been on operations that never made the news, that her call sign, which she'd never mentioned, was Nightjar, named after a bird that flew in complete silence and hunted by sound rather than sight. He'd learned that she'd earned her trident on her first attempt, one of only 17 women to complete SEAL training since the program opened to females in 2016. He'd learned that she'd been shot twice in Kandahar province, taken 3 weeks of recovery, and gone back to her team rather than accept a staff position. All of this information made him respect her more and fear the coming evolution less. Knowledge was the antidote to assumption. At 05:45, Corrigan gathered his team in the office complex's ground floor lobby. "Listen up," he said quietly. "They're going to come at us the way we should have come at them. Quiet, patient, using our own expectations against us. So we're going to do something they won't expect. We're going to give them exactly what they think they want, and then we're going to make them pay for taking it." He outlined his plan in quick, efficient sentences. They would defend the 3rd floor as expected, but they would make it look too easy. They would leave obvious gaps in their coverage. They would create what looked like a perfect approach, and then they would turn that approach into a meat grinder. "The key," Corrigan said, "is that we have to sell it. If they think it's a trap, they'll find another way. But if they think we're just predictable Marines who don't know how to fight smart, they'll take the bait." Tors, the combat engineer, raised his hand. "Staff Sergeant, that requires us to act like we're stupider than we are. You really think a SEAL team is going to believe that?" Corrigan smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. "After Friday, yeah, I think they might." At 0600, the exercise went live. Kask and her team had been given the same intelligence package the Marines had received on Friday: building layout, known defender positions, mission parameters. They had 4 hours to plan and 8 hours to execute. They set up in a warehouse 300 meters from the target building. Kask spread the building schematics across a folding table while her team gathered around. "They'll have learned from Friday," she said without preamble. "Corrigan's a good NCO. He'll have studied what we did and adapted, so we need to assume they're not going to make the same mistakes twice." One of her teammates, a petty officer named Rykov with a thick Boston accent, tapped the 3rd floor on the schematic. "HVT's here northeast corner, same as Friday. That's the objective. They know we have to come to them." Another teammate, a woman named Lieutenant Dana Ortiz, who'd been the one to take out Dietrich and Tors from the maintenance shed, studied the approach routes. 3 stairwells, east, west, and center. Elevator shaft that could be used for insertion if we breach the roof. 4 potential entry points on the ground floor, plus windows on all 3 levels. Kask nodded slowly. She was thinking about Staff Sergeant Corrigan, thinking about the look in his eyes when he'd come back to the briefing room. He wasn't stupid. He wasn't going to set up a conventional defense and hope for the best. He was going to try to turn her own tactics against her, which meant she needed to think like he would think she would think. It was tactical chess played at 3 levels simultaneously, and the first person to forget that the opponent was also adapting would lose. "We're going to do something unusual," she said finally. "We're going to go in loud and fast, full breach, flashbangs and speed, everything they expect." Her team looked at her with expressions ranging from surprise to skepticism. Going loud was the opposite of how they'd operated on Friday. It was the opposite of every advantage they had. "They're expecting us to be sneaky," Kask continued. "They're expecting us to use the same tactics, so they'll have set up their defense to counter infiltration and ambush. They'll be watching for the subtle approach, which means they might not be fully prepared for an old-fashioned frontal assault." Rykov grinned. "Ma'am, that's either brilliant or insane." Kask met his eyes. "Let's find out which." At 1300 hours, Kask's team moved into position. They'd spent the morning rehearsing immediate action drills and breach protocols. They'd talked through contingencies and fallback plans. They'd done everything a professional assault force does when preparing to hit a defended structure. At 13:15, they executed. The explosion that took out the east ground floor entrance wasn't simulated. It was a training charge, calculated to blow the door and create noise and confusion without bringing down the building. The sound rolled across the base like thunder. Inside the office complex, Corrigan felt the vibration through his boots and smiled. They'd come in loud, just as he'd hoped. His team was positioned on the 3rd floor, but not in the way Kask would expect. He'd left 2 Marines in obvious defensive positions near the HVT room. They were visible from the stairwell, and they were covering the most direct approach with overlapping fields of fire. It looked exactly like what a competent but conventional defense should look like. What Kask wouldn't see immediately was the other 4 Marines positioned in offices along the 2nd floor corridor, with lines of fire angled upward through thin office walls to cover the 3rd floor hallway. The plan was to let the SEALs think they'd identified the primary defensive position, let them maneuver to flank it, and then hit them from below while they were focused upward. It was elegant in its simplicity. It relied on the SEALs being good enough to spot the obvious threat and smart enough to try to outmaneuver it. Kask's team came through the blown door like a thunderstorm. Rykov and Ortiz went left, clearing the ground floor lobby with practiced efficiency. Kask and her 4th teammate, a quiet senior petty officer named Chen who spoke 3 languages and could move through a building like smoke, went right. They moved fast but not reckless, covering angles and checking corners. The ground floor was empty. 2nd floor, east stairwell. Kask went up with Chen on her 6, weapons tracking the angles. The stairwell was narrow and the walls were concrete. Good for defense, terrible for assault. At the 2nd floor landing, Chen held up a fist, listening. Somewhere above them, footsteps, deliberate. Someone wanted them to hear. Kask considered 2 options: take the bait and continue up the stairwell, which was almost certainly covered by defensive fire, or find another route. She signaled Chen and they moved back down quickly and quietly. In the 2nd floor corridor, she regrouped with Rykov and Ortiz. "They're set up on 3, she sub-vocalized into her radio, "making noise to draw us up, which means they want us in the stairwell." Ortiz nodded. "Elevator shaft," Kask shook her head. "Too obvious, they'll have that covered." She looked at the ceiling tiles. Standard drop ceiling, the kind found in every office building built in the last 30 years. Above those tiles would be a crawlspace, maybe 2 feet high, filled with ductwork and electrical conduit. It would be cramped, dark, and miserable. It would also bypass the defended stairwell entirely. "We're going up through the ceiling," she said. Rykov looked at the tiles, then at Kask, then back at the tiles. "Ma'am, that's going to be tight." Kask was already pulling a tile aside. "Good thing we're smaller than Marines." On the 3rd floor, Staff Sergeant Corrigan was starting to worry. It had been 9 minutes since the breach, and the SEALs hadn't come up the stairwells. They hadn't tried the elevator shaft. They hadn't appeared at any of the windows, which meant they'd found option 4, whatever that was. He keyed his radio. "All positions report." The 2 Marines in the HVT room reported negative contact. The 4 Marines on the 2nd floor, positioned to ambush anyone moving up the internal stairwells, reported negative contact. Everyone was in position. No one had seen the opposing force. Corrigan moved to the east stairwell and looked down, empty. He looked up at the ceiling, standard office tiles, and then he understood. "They're in the ceiling," he said into his radio, his voice tight. "Second floor, they're coming up through the crawlspace. Reposition now." But now was already too late. Kask had reached the third-floor crawlspace 12 seconds earlier. The space above the ceiling was exactly as miserable as she'd expected. Dark, hot, filled with dust and the smell of old insulation. She crawled forward on her elbows, her rifle slung across her back, her breathing controlled. Behind her, Chen moved like a shadow. They could hear the Marines below them, the sound of boots on floor and voices on radios. Kask counted ceiling tiles, matching them to the building schematic she'd memorized. The HVT room should be 15 tiles forward and 6 tiles left. She moved with painful slowness. 1 tile, 2 tiles. The ductwork forced her to angle right, then back left. Chen's breathing was steady behind her. At tile 13, she heard voices directly below. 2 men, their words muffled by the ceiling. Humming up through the crawlspace. Reposition now. They knew. But knowing and responding were different things. Kask reached tile 15, adjusted her position, and drew her sidearm. She had maybe 15 seconds before the Marines repositioned and figured out exactly where she was. 15 seconds to drop through the ceiling, neutralize 2 defenders, and secure the HVT. She looked back at Chen and held up 3 fingers, 2 fingers, 1 finger. She pushed aside the ceiling tile and dropped through. The room was an office, maybe 12 by 12, with a desk and 2 chairs and a window overlooking the base. The high-value target was a mannequin dressed in civilian clothes, seated behind the desk. The 2 Marines were exactly where Kask had calculated they'd be, positioned to cover the door and the window. They weren't positioned to cover the ceiling because who drops through a ceiling in a third-floor office? Kask landed in a crouch and her weapon was already up. She put 2 simulated rounds into the first Marine before he could turn. "Sue, KIA," the range safety officer announced. The second Marine, Williams, was faster. He got his weapon around and actually got a shot off, but he was firing from a standing position at a target already in cover behind the desk. His shot went high. Kask's didn't. Williams, KIA. Chen dropped through the ceiling a half-second later, landing with his weapon covering the door. Kask moved to the mannequin and keyed her radio. Objective secure. Package acquired. Moving to extract. In the hallway outside, Corrigan heard the shots and knew it was over. Kask had gotten to the HVT without ever entering the kill zones he'd prepared. She'd bypassed his entire defensive plan by using an approach route he'd considered too difficult and too slow. He leaned against the wall and laughed, a short bitter sound. Through the door he heard Lieutenant Kask's voice, calm and professional. "Staff Sergeant, we're coming out. Exercise is complete." Corrigan opened the door. Kask stood behind the desk, her weapon lowered, her face streaked with dust and sweat. Chen was by the window, still covering the approaches. The 2 eliminated Marines sat against the wall, looking disgusted with themselves. 4 minutes, Corrigan said. "From breach to objective secure." 4 goddamn minutes. Kask holstered her weapon. "You had a good plan, Staff Sergeant. If we'd come up the stairs, you would have shredded us. But in special operations, there's no such thing as a plan the enemy can't counter. There's only the question of whether you can adapt faster than they can." She moved toward the door, then paused. "The defense you set up was solid, smart, layered. If you'd had 1 more person watching the ceiling, we wouldn't have made it. That's not a failure of planning. That's just math. Sometimes 6 isn't enough." After the exercise, after the debrief, after the observers had filed out and the official evaluations had been submitted, the 6 Marines and 4 SEALs ended up at the base enlisted club. It wasn't planned. It just happened, the way these things do when people who have spent 2 days trying to kill each other in simulation realize they're on the same side. Corrigan bought the first round. Kask accepted a beer but nursed it slowly, answering questions about training and deployment and what it was like to be one of only a handful of women wearing the trident. She didn't make it sound heroic. She made it sound like work. Hard work, the kind that broke some people and forged others. "The physical stuff is the easy part," she said, responding to a question from Tors about Hell Week. "Pain is temporary. Exhaustion is temporary. What breaks people is the mental game. The part where your body is screaming at you to quit and your brain is making up very reasonable arguments for why continuing is actually stupid, and you have to find something deeper than reason to keep moving. Park, the corporal who'd made the comment in the first briefing, had been silent most of the evening. Finally, he spoke up. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology." Kask looked at him. "For what, Corporal?" "For," he hesitated, "for not taking you seriously in the first briefing, for the comment." The table went quiet. Everyone remembered the comment, though no one had mentioned it. Kask set down her beer. "You were doing what young Marines do," she said. "Testing boundaries, seeing what you could get away with. If I let something like that bother me, I'd have quit the first week of training." Park shook his head. "No, ma'am, I was being an asshole because you're a woman and I didn't think women belonged in combat. And you proved me wrong so hard I don't think I'll ever make that mistake again." Kask studied him for a long moment. "Here's the thing, Corporal. You're going to serve with women in combat whether you like it or not. The military decided that's the policy, and your opinion on the policy doesn't matter. What matters is whether you can work with female Marines and sailors and soldiers as professionals, whether you can trust them to do their jobs, whether you can take orders from them when they outrank you and give orders to them when you outrank them, whether you can focus on the mission instead of the gender of the person next to you." She paused. "I don't need your apology. I need your professionalism. That's the deal. I'll do my job at the highest possible level and you'll treat me like any other operator. Nothing more, nothing less." Park nodded slowly. "Roger that, ma'am." The conversation moved on. They talked about deployments and training, and the eternal military complaints about equipment and leadership and administrative nonsense. They talked about the upcoming rotation schedule and who was going where. They talked about everything except the thing they were all thinking about, which was that in maybe 6 months some of them would be downrange, and some of them might not come back, and the training exercises that seemed so important now would be distant memories compared to the real thing. At 2200, Kask excused herself. She had an early morning flight to Virginia for a conference on integrated special operations tactics. The SEALs filtered out shortly after. The Marines remained, staring into their drinks. Finally, Corrigan spoke. "That woman is going to be a legend someday," he said quietly. "And we're going to tell people we trained with her and they're not going to believe us." He was right, but not in the way he expected. 2 years later, Lieutenant Vera Kask was in Afghanistan's Kunar province, attached to a joint SEAL Marine operation targeting a high-value Taliban commander. The operation went wrong in the way operations sometimes do. Intelligence was bad. The compound was bigger than expected. The enemy was better armed than briefed. The assault force got pinned down in a courtyard that looked almost exactly like the training courtyard at Coronado, and 3 Marines were wounded in the first 30 seconds of contact. Among those Marines was Staff Sergeant Michael Corrigan, who took shrapnel from an RPG that detonated against the courtyard wall. He was conscious but bleeding, and the Taliban fighters on the rooftops had the entire assault force in a perfect kill zone. It was textbook ambush, and it was going to end with everyone in that courtyard dead unless something changed very quickly. What changed was Lieutenant Kask. She'd been with the support element, providing overwatch from a building 200 meters north. When the ambush was sprung, she made a decision that wasn't in any manual. She took her 3-person element and they went over the rooftops, moving building to building in the darkness, using the same principles she'd used in training. Patience, precision, understanding the enemy's perspective better than they understood hers. They came up behind the Taliban positions from an angle no one expected. They eliminated 4 fighters in 12 seconds with suppressed weapons, so quietly that the other enemy combatants didn't realize their flanks had collapsed until Kask's element was already repositioning. The ambush turned into a rout. The Taliban broke and ran, and the assault force was able to extract with their wounded. Corrigan survived because of a medevac that got him out in time, and the medevac got in because Kask had broken the ambush. He was back at Camp Leatherneck 2 days later, his arm in a sling and 17 stitches holding his shoulder together, when he heard the full story. One of the SEALs who'd been in the courtyard told him how Cask had moved, how she controlled her element with hand signals and whispers, how she turned a disaster into a mission success through sheer tactical audacity. "She saved your life," the SEAL said. "She saved all our lives. That woman is unkillable." Corrigan thought about the training exercise, about the courtyard, about "Try not to cry, princess," about how close he'd come to dismissing the person who would later keep him alive. When he rotated back to Coronado 6 months later, he made a point of finding Lieutenant Cask. She was preparing for another deployment, running training evolutions with a new SEAL team. He caught her between briefs and asked for 5 minutes. They walked along the beach, the Pacific cold and gray under overcast skies. "I wanted to say thank you," Corrigan said, "for Cunnar, for keeping me breathing." Cask looked out at the water. "You would have done the same for me, Staff Sergeant." "Maybe. But I want you to know that what you did out there, that's going to ripple. I'm going to tell that story for the rest of my career. Every young Marine I train is going to hear about the SEAL who came over the rooftops in Cunnar. And I'm going to make sure they understand that competence doesn't care about gender. Mission success doesn't care about politics. When the shooting starts, the only thing that matters is whether you can do the job." Cask nodded slowly. "That's all any of us want, Staff Sergeant. To be judged on what we do, not what we are." They stood in silence for a moment, watching the waves. Somewhere down the beach, a group of SEAL candidates was running in formation, their instructor's voice carrying on the wind. Finally, Corrigan said, "Permission to ask a personal question, ma'am." "Granted." "Your call sign, Nightjar, how'd you get it?" Cask smiled, and it was the first time Corrigan had seen her smile like that, open and genuine. "Hell Week," she said. "Third night. We were doing surf torture and I wasn't making any noise. Everyone else was groaning or cursing or crying and I was just quiet. One of the instructors said I was like a nightjar, this bird that hunts silently at night. It stuck." She paused. "My mom was a birder. She used to take me out at dawn to watch migrations. She died when I was 17, cancer. I think about her every time someone uses that call sign." Corrigan nodded. He understood about carrying the dead with you. Every Marine did. "She'd be proud of you," he said. "For what it's worth, from a jarhead who underestimated you." Cask looked at him directly. "You didn't underestimate me after the first evolution, Staff Sergeant. That's what matters. A lot of people never get past their first impression. You did. That takes more courage than most people have." She checked her watch. "I have to get to a brief. Take care of that shoulder." Corrigan watched her walk back toward the base buildings, her stride efficient and purposeful. He thought about how history was written, how some people ended up in textbooks and some people ended up as footnotes, and some people, the ones who did the hardest work in the quietest ways, ended up forgotten entirely. He decided then that he wouldn't let that happen, that he'd tell the story of Lieutenant Vera Cask to everyone who would listen, that he'd make sure the legend was built on truth, not mythology. He didn't know that 5 years later, Vera would be a lieutenant commander, that she'd be running SEAL training evolutions and writing doctrine on female integration in special operations, that she'd testify before Congress on the effectiveness of mixed-gender combat teams, that she'd deploy 4 more times, to Syria and Iraq and places that would remain classified for decades, that she'd eventually retire as a captain and take a position at the Naval War College, teaching the next generation about tactics and leadership, and the things that mattered more than strength or speed. He didn't know that Park, the corporal who'd made the comment, would end up as a major in the Marine Corps and would require all his junior officers to study integrated combat operations, using Cask's Cunnar action as a case study. He didn't know that Torres would leave the Corps and become a defense contractor, designing training facilities that incorporated the lessons Cask had taught them about asymmetric thinking. He didn't know that the 6 Marines and 4 SEALs who'd spent those 3 days at Coronado would end up scattered across the world, carrying pieces of what they'd learned into every operation they conducted and every person they trained. But he knew enough. He knew that he'd been changed by meeting someone who was better at the job than he was, who'd proven it not through speeches or politics but through performance, who'd shown him that his assumptions were limitations, and that the military he loved would be stronger when it stopped measuring people by categories and started measuring them by capability. The sun was setting over the Pacific. turning the water into hammered copper. Corrigan started the long walk back to the barracks. His shoulder ached, but it was a good ache, the kind that reminded him he was alive when he might not have been. Behind him, the waves rolled in with their eternal rhythm, indifferent to human stories. But the humans kept telling the stories anyway because that's what humans do. They remember, they learn, they adapt. And sometimes, if they're lucky and paying attention, they become better versions of themselves. On a beach in California, with the smell of salt and the sound of the surf and the memory of a courtyard in Afghanistan, Staff Sergeant Michael Corrigan understood that he'd been given a gift. Not the gift of survival, though that mattered, the gift of perspective. Years later, when Corrigan was a sergeant major and had forgotten more about combat than most people would ever know, a young lieutenant asked him about leadership. They were at a bar near Camp Pendleton, and the lieutenant was fresh from the basic school, full of book knowledge and theory. "Sergeant Major," the lieutenant said, "what's the most important thing you've learned about leading Marines?" Corrigan thought about it. He thought about firefights and training exercises and all the moments that had shaped him. He thought about a briefing room at Coronado and 6 Marines who thought they knew everything. "The most important thing," he said slowly, "is that leadership isn't about being the toughest or the strongest or the loudest. It's about recognizing competence wherever you find it and being humble enough to learn from people who are better than you at something." He told the lieutenant about Vera Kask, about the training evolution and the ambush and the rooftops of Kunar. He told the story the way it deserved to be told, with honesty and detail and respect. The lieutenant listened, and when Corrigan was finished, the young officer said, "That's a good story, Sergeant Major." Corrigan shook his head. "It's not a story, Lieutenant, it's a lesson. The lesson is that the military isn't about you. It's not about me. It's about the mission and the people you serve with. And the moment you forget that, the moment you start thinking your opinion matters more than someone's ability to do the job, that's the moment you become a liability instead of an asset." The lieutenant nodded thoughtfully. Corrigan hoped the words would stick, hoped this young officer would carry them forward, would remember them when faced with situations that challenged preconceptions and assumptions. He hoped, but he didn't know. That was the nature of teaching. You put the lessons out there and trusted that some of them would take root. Across the country, in Rhode Island, Captain Vera Kask was giving a lecture to a class of mid-career officers at the Naval War College. The topic was integrated operations in austere environments. She used the Coronado training evolution as a case study, though she didn't mention it had been her evolution. She framed it as lessons learned from an unnamed SEAL officer working with an unnamed Marine unit. "The key principle," she told the assembled officers, "is that asymmetric thinking isn't about physical advantages. It's about cognitive flexibility. The side that can adapt faster, that can see the battlefield from multiple perspectives simultaneously, that can abandon doctrine when doctrine becomes predictive, that's the side that wins." She showed them the building schematics, showed them how the Marines had set up their defense and how the SEAL element had bypassed it, showed them the decision tree and the risk calculations. "The Marines did everything right according to their training," she said, "but their training was based on fighting a symmetrical enemy. The moment you face an opponent who refuses to fight symmetrically, all that training can become a handicap if you're not careful." An Army colonel in the third row raised his hand. "Captain, how do you train people to think asymmetrically? It seems like it requires a kind of creativity that's hard to teach." Kask smiled. "You train it by putting people in situations where the conventional solution doesn't work, by making them uncomfortable, by forcing them to adapt or fail. And then, critically, you debrief honestly. You don't just tell them they failed, you show them why they failed and you show them what success would have looked like. You turn failure into education." She paused. "And you have to create a culture where it's okay to fail and